It's good to see everybody here. It's great to see everybody here for the first public event of the year for the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies. We're super excited to be hosting a big campus event on the new Pope. So thank you, and I want to thank especially my Dominican brothers in the Priory, who are the major co-sponsors for this event. And I thank Father Sicard, our president, for coming, and our prior, Father Joe Guido. And if you permit me just a couple of seconds here, there's just a bunch of people who make things go, and I would be remiss if I didn't name them to start. And so thanks to our friends in institutional advancement, and especially Katie Davenport. Without their support, none of this is possible. And to our friends in event planning, especially Jacob Olson and Liz Bazzario, media services, who will be recording the event, thank you for setting everything up. And finally, to my colleagues in mission and ministry, who are always so helpful, Pam Tremblay and Bob Funder, and to our new student coordinator, Emma Chrisman. With that said, let me introduce our very exciting panel. I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Father Patrick Mary Briscoe is the former editor-in-chief of Aletheia, the global news and spirituality website, and the former editor-in-chief of Our Sunday Visitor magazine. He is currently the general promoter of social communication for the Dominican Order based out of Rome. During the conclave which elected Leo XIV, Father Briscoe provided analysis and commentary for EWTN, CBS, NBC, and CNN. A native of Fort Wayne, Indiana, Father Patrick joined the Order of Preachers in 2010, and along with his Dominican brothers, he is host of the podcast Godsplaining and a co-author of St. Dominic's Way of Life, A Path to Knowing and Loving God. Dr. Russell Hittinger is the executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. He was previously the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies and research professor of law at the University of Tulsa. Dr. Hittinger's scholarship is focused on the intersection of philosophy, religion, and law, with particular emphasis on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. For the past several years, he has worked and published extensively on the history of Catholic social thought since the 18th century. Dr. Hittinger is on the governing council of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. And finally, Dr. Cathleen Kaveny serves as the Darrell and Juliet Libby Millennium Professor at Boston College, a position that includes appointments both in the theology department and in the law school. She's the first faculty member to hold such a joint appointment. Dr. Kaveny's work focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality. She teaches regularly contract law to first-year law students and also teaches a number of seminars that explore the relationship between theology, philosophy, and law, such as faith, morality, and law, mercy and justice, and complicity. Dr. Kaveny is the author of 4 books and more than 100 articles and essays in the areas of law, ethics, and medical ethics. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Father Justin, very much for the invitation to be with you all in this community today, and to Russ and Kathy. I'm so excited about today's conversation. Partly I'm excited about it because I don't have the professional credentials that these two incredible thinkers do, and it's a massive privilege to stand among them. I'm that disgusting and decrepit figure that you would call a journalist, which you can apparently become by just doing journalism, and suddenly you can be a journalist. It's quite amazing. The way that I experienced the election of Pope Leo XIV was there in Rome, and I was covering it for Our Sunday Visitor and contributing to the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Commentary and the various television outlets that we named in the introduction. And I recall exactly the moment, as maybe you all do, have a story when the announcement was made that Cardinal Prevost has been elected, or that there was an election. I was there in the square, and I had just finished a spot with CNN, and I was running across the square to get up to the Braccio, to the arm of St. Peter's, so that I could be close when the announcement was made. When the Pope is elected, of course, we have the white smoke revealing itself, the bells ringing, and at that moment, the most chaos that happens in Rome begins, because everyone interested in the election descends from throughout the city upon St. Peter's Square. It's really an incredible race to see, so I wanted a good view of it, and I'm running to get up on top there of the arm. And I got there right before the cardinal came out to make the announcement of who had been elected, because of course we get the signs that the election had happened, and then comes the announcement of the one who was elected and his name. And when the cardinal announced who had been elected, I heard the name clearly, and I knew that he was an American, but I was in such shock, I turned to my Polish colleague, and I said, "Who was elected?" And she said it was an American. Now, of course, a number of Vaticanists had been watching, and more importantly, speaking with all the cardinals leading up to the election. And the night before the conclave, one of these very serious fellows grabbed me in St. Peter's Square. I said to him, "Who do you think it's going to be?" And he said, "Prevost really has a chance." And that was when I was convinced the night before that it was going to be him, based on the person that had given me this warning. But it was from that moment when my Polish colleague says, "It's the American," when she said to me, "It's the American," I knew we would be in for something very interesting with Pope Leo. And he confirmed that immediately in succession. So I was at the first Regina Caeli in Rome where he sang, which I know doesn't sound like a big deal. You say the Pope sings, but his predecessor, Francis, had not sung. Even John Paul II was not much of a singer in that way. And it showed us that he was confident in being his own man and that he was going to take his own approach to these questions. And then the following day, Monday morning, when he had his first public audience, which was with journalists, he made it very clear that he was going to handle things his own way, and giving us a little sense of his spirit. But we learned very early on, as he addressed the cardinals of the church, that he had chosen his name for a very specific reason. The name of Pope Leo XIV was taken in homage to his predecessor, Leo XIII, not his immediate predecessor, of course, that was Francis, but in honor of Leo XIII. And many people made the connection to the question of the rise of artificial intelligence and the changes that that meant for society. And Pope Leo XIV confirmed that was true, but that it was even greater, because what he told us was it wasn't simply the particular question of the development of AI. It was that he was seeing that the church had found herself living in a moment of history that was a new age of revolution. It was a new age of revolution. And for Leo XIV, it was the kind of revolution that we had seen at the end of the 19th century, that was overseen, or where the church was being led through this revolution by Leo XIII. So it's not simply a new technological development. And this, I think, is really key. We're not simply seeing one particular change in our society. We're seeing a fundamental change of society, not a change in society, but a change of society. That we're seeing not just a particular development, but rather a reconfiguration, a new revolution, and that AI was not going to be just one technology among many, but it was going to have a kind of fundamental shift in the way that we were living. So what I wish to propose to us at the beginning of our conversation here about Pope Leo is that there are three things that we're seeing emerge from his pontificate that have their roots in Leo XIV that can be guides for us, principles, as we approach this question of not just a developing technology, but of a development of our society, of a revolutionary change in the way that we're living. Okay, the first is the question of the just wage. The first is the question of the just wage. For Leo XIII, this is a seminal question at the end of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution has caused a crisis in family life. I'm going to say a few things about that later, compensation has to remain just for workers in a new kind of assessment, because it can't simply be about productivity. That can no longer really be the question anymore, because AI is going to change the model of productivity. So workers have to be provided a just or a living wage independent of the adaptations of productivity that are going to happen. This is my proposal to you. And why do I think that this is the mind of Pope Leo XIV? Well, because he's telling us in this fantastic interview that came out earlier this week. The timing was great, by the way. I completely rewrote what I was going to say to you all with this marvelous interview with my friend Elise Allen, who's the first journalist to conduct a long-form interview with Pope Leo XIV. If you haven't read it yet, do read it. It's on Crux on her website. It's in several parts. She is the biographer of Pope Leo XIV, and there's going to be many fantastic things coming out of her conversations with him. But one of them is this gem. So it's been announced that Elon Musk will be the world's first trillionaire. And this comes up in the course of their conversation. And Pope Leo XIV says, if that, meaning money, if that is the only thing that has value anymore, then we're in big trouble. I love this. This is the way the Pope is speaking. It's so colloquial and accessible, but deeply true. If that, meaning a salary, meaning money, is the only thing that has value anymore, then we're in big trouble. So the question of the just wage, which was raised again by Leo XIII in the time of the Industrial Revolution, is just as relevant now with Leo XIV and the rise of AI. And again, it's simply because a wage has to be measured by more, or rather has to be given or assessed by more than just simple productivity. Okay. So the second idea that I want to point out to you is solidarity. Solidarity, which is a core principle of Catholic social teaching, which emerges from Pope Leo XIII in the modern expression in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. When I say this word, what I really mean is mutual support or fraternity. In Leo XIV, we're seeing expressions of this principle of solidarity that are very in line with Pope Francis. With Pope Francis, we had the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Brothers All, but more importantly, the encyclical that I think is the most important of Francis' pontificate, which is Laudato Si. Many people know this work of Pope Francis as the encyclical that's about the environment. And if that's all you know about this encyclical letter, Laudato Si, please go and reread it, because it's not about the environment at all, actually. This is a little bit contentious. It's not chiefly about the environment, I ought to say. It's principally about a vision for human flourishing. The terms that Pope Francis used in his magisterium are talking about human ecology, for example, which he developed from Benedict XVI. What I really want to say in the magisterium of Leo XIV and the challenge that AI presents is that we have to continue to develop solidarity as a core principle, mutual support, that is, human fraternity, because that is what will allow a truly human ethic to flourish. That's what will prevent us from falling prey to the kinds of things that the computer can do and allow us to defend instead real wisdom. Pope Leo XIV expresses it this way. He says we have to ask the questions of where does human dignity come from? And how can we use that, he says. How can we use that to show that it's possible to build a better world? He was also making this point in the interview he did with Elise Allen. Where does human dignity come from? And how can we use that to show that it's possible to build a better world? This is very interesting in the face of 20th century, in the face of the fall and despair of the 20th century. It's a new kind of optimism that Pope Leo is expressing. And it's an optimism grounded in faith, but that has an expression of a desire for human fraternity. And I think this element of hope, this proposal of hope, is very important. He is building a living model of this vision at Castel Gandolfo right now. There is a project called Borgo Laudato Si Village, which is to be an application of the principles of Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si. It's a lived version of Laudato Si. It includes things like a home for unwed mothers and training for migrant workers, as well as more directly environmental and ecological projects. This is the first major project that Pope Leo has inaugurated in his pontificate. There was a formal blessing and opening of Borgo Laudato Si. And again, I think it points us to this more fundamental point, not just environmentalism, but solidarity, understood as mutual support or human fraternity, which gives us a kind of optimism to engage and to build and to move forward, even in the face of the great challenge of AI. Okay, and lastly, lest I go on for too long, of course, it must be said that for Pope Leo XIV, he understands that the greatest thing he can bring is an openness to the transcendent. What a technological development like AI presents is the great risk of being trapped in a materialist vision of the world. And Leo XIV says his fundamental vision, his fundamental job as Pope is not to solve the world's problems, but to preach the good news, to preach the gospel. He described himself on the balcony of St. Peter's as a missionary. He preached this in his first homily in his address in the Sistine Chapel of the Cardinals. We should appreciate this as a kind of emphasis, again, on the openness that's required in our day to the transcendent, because otherwise we'll simply be trapped. We'll be trapped in again, this materialist development, and we'll be limited rather than opened and encouraged by the developments of AI. So friends, I offer you these three principles, these three simple ideas from Leo XIV that I think have their roots in Leo XIII, that are something of a foundation as we begin to approach what I think is our day's most prescient question, which is the development of artificial intelligence and the revolution it's going to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Justin. And thank all of you for coming. I'm always delighted to be back in Providence. The school, of course, but also the restaurants. The school, of course, but also the restaurants. I'm going to make 3 points, too. We'll see how I can jam them together. It was famous, Rerum Novarum was famous by 3 days of being published. They had the advantage back then of newspapers and telegraphs, which allowed Leo to have his thoughts, well, in the New York Times. It was the first papal encyclical ever printed in full in the New York Times. But here's the interesting thing about it. He was 81 years old when he wrote this with a team. And he was only getting better at 81. He wrote more than 100 encyclicals. And that's not counting about 60 that he did as Archbishop of Perugia before he was Pope. He got better with age, not just in quantity, but the quality of his teaching letters. Yeah. Rerum Novarum is elegantly simple and concise, especially compared to some of the encyclicals we've had the last 30 or 40 years, which turned out to be mammoth encyclicals. You can read Rerum Novarum in 35 minutes. That's not to say you shouldn't take another 35 to read it again, but it's remarkably short, even compared to some of Leo's other famous encyclicals. And so I think the advice to be given to Leo XIV, take your time. Leo got better by the time he was in his 80s. Okay. By the way, one of his first official acts, having been elected Pope, that is Leo XIII, is that he banned castrati from the Sistine Choir. And I always like to tell people, this is the beginning of Neo-Thomism, you see, that this is going to be a serious operation in his Vatican. Interestingly, too, Rerum Novarum has relatively little to say about the state. It only crops up at the end, important way it crops up, but relatively little about the state compared to his earlier encyclicals that went on and on about the deprecations to Christian culture of Germany, France, Italy especially. He hated the Italian government because it confiscated all the church properties. He could never get over that. Very friendly to the United States. But, so here it is. In 35 minutes, 4 arguments in plain Italian to begin with, and then in Latin. It was well translated in English. By the way, there were no official translations back then. Pacem in Terris in 1963 is the first papal encyclical that had an official translation, and it was bungled because they gave it to L'Osservatore Romano. But that's a whole other story. In the old days, Catholic Truth Societies would translate the encyclicals in various languages, German and English and whatever. So, 4 things. First argument, 8 paragraphs. The importance of human work, that is, of labor, is to fulfill St. John Damascene's famous adage, which Aquinas uses for the introduction to the Secunda Pars. Made unto the image and likeness of God, the human can act, both for the sake of his own perfection and that of others. That is the lead-off to Rerum Novarum, that the dignity of work is not merely acquiring things, but it's in accord with a rational animal. Rational animality understands work to be something more than the acquisition of things. Second argument, maybe the best part of the encyclical. And when we speak of being provident for others, we have to understand that the worker's dignity is to provide for his family. So he touches on a real society. In fact, 2 real societies, marriage and the family. So the dignity of the worker is not just to show up every morning for a daily paycheck, 25 cents or whatever it is. You have to have property as a stable thing to be provident for a family for 35 more years. It's a brilliantly succinct argument because it's rooted not in the question of the state, for starters, or business or anything else, but on the ground. He says in Rerum Novarum, nothing is more useful than to look upon the world as it really is. And that's the second part of Rerum Novarum. This is why we're going to call it a social encyclical. The third argument is the right to form associations other than marriage, church, and state. That is sodalities, what we would today call unions, although he does not use the word because it was too inflammatory in the late 19th century. That is, to form social ties that are not reducible to the state or the family. Back then, it wouldn't have been possible to say even motorcycle clubs, provided that there's nothing immoral about them, but all sorts of different associations. And most people today make a beeline for that third part of Rerum Novarum, because it still seems so relevant. And then the fourth part, and these associations have to be protected by the state, even in questions of collective bargaining. So, bam, bam, bam. It's beautifully accomplished. Now, my second point, Leo never called this social doctrine. And this is something worth reflecting on. Doctrina Socialis is not formally installed in the Vatican thing until 1931. That was Quadragesimo Anno. Leo still used the old-fashioned medieval term Doctrina Civilis, which is the word for the state. But they didn't mean by civilis, civilis once upon a time, that adjective, the 19th century state. I think this is why Pius XI, his student, weighed in on Socialis. Just what is a social issue? I remember this is the era of Marx and Durkheim. Famously from Marx, all that is solid melts into the air. He's referring to social realities. This is not, in the first place, an argument about the state. It's about the unraveling of society. So was Durkheim's main work. Actually, states were doing relatively well. Germany, France, USA, Italy. They had figured out by late 19th century how to be states. That is, they figured out how to do mandatory education. They had figured out how to build military, how to have laws of conscription. They had figured out navies that were not only military, but were capable of linking all 5 continents of the world by trade. Every single continent on Earth was penetrated to its interior by railroads that took the materials to ports, that brought them to England and over to Germany to be finished products. They'd figured out all these things. They actually knew how to be states. And so Leo is raising the problem of not whether they're states. He backed off of that kind of contest by 1891. But they have to pay attention to the social issues. Right? It's not enough to just have all of the equipment and be able to deploy it. Of course, World War I hadn't happened yet. Late 19th century, it was relatively peaceful in that regard. They'd figured out how to be states. And his argument is the first job of the state is actually distributive justice. That's what the social whole, the civitas, owes to its social parts on the basis of merit or need. And that's what these states were concerned about on the matter of labor unions. Because labor unions looked like a Marxist argument to capacitate societies other than those formed by commutation, right? And those societies giving allegiance to the state. The states love that. That's called patriotism. They were concerned about distributive justice as being a cauldron of turmoil. And it was brilliant that Leo, eventually became best friends with Bismarck. He persuaded Bismarck to give up Kulturkampf. And that distributive justice is an important thing, not just commutation. Everyone knows commutation is important. You can't have real economies without it. Everyone knows that our loyalty to the social whole, or civitas, is important. It was the distribution issue, and Germany effected the first system, really state system of distributive justice. Social security, on and on and on. It was a fine moment for Leo. By the way, before Leo died, he gave the highest lay medal given by the papacy to Bismarck. It's fascinating. My third point is this. Leo really did admire social pluralism. If you mean by pluralism, the ability of communities other than the state to be about their business and work for the common good. Maybe he's even most famous for that point. He was very much given to education. Yeah, Catholic U was established as a pontifical faculty. It was not a pontifical school, but a faculty in 1887. And it was serious education. There were no undergraduates then. Okay. He admired the American spunk with regard to school systems and private education. And when he wrote the famous letter to the American episcopacy, toward the end of his papacy, he wrote, "For the church among you, unopposed by the Constitution and the government of your nation, fettered by no hostile legislation, protected against violence by the common laws and the impartiality of tribunals." It was a real insight into the ability of a real state-making regime, coast to coast. By the time Leo was even elected, it was coast to coast, to have an adequate sense of the social pluralism and then institutional pluralism. The first institutional limit on government is that it be a real government. And it can't be a real government unless it fosters and protects its own social parts to be about their business for the common good. So these are all very, very profound matters. He did a good job of it, including when he banned the castrati for the Sistine trial. Okay, thank you. That's all I'm going to say.
Going to set a timer so I don't go over. Oh, yeah. Yes. Thank you. Well, it is a delight for me to be here at Providence College. I am a proud Rhode Islander myself. I grew up in Cumberland, up north a bit. And we've got many family connections to Providence College. My dad went to PC. My uncle Bob went to PC, and he was a star, we're told, in the family. On the basketball team. As you can see, that was not likely to be my particular gift and talent. But I did take a very fine summer course here many years ago in biology. And I remember the summer and the time on campus very well. But I do have to say that I'm delighted to be asked to come back here, and even more thrilled not to have to dissect a frog while I'm here. Dissecting a Vatican document is a much more pleasant, endeavor. So I'd like to back up a minute and ask a couple of questions about our questions. What's in a name? What does Gioacchino Vincenzo Raffaele Luigi Pecce, born near Rome on March 2nd, 1810, have to do with Robert Louis Prevost, born on September 14th, 1955 in Chicago? Well, they are both supreme pontiffs of the Roman Catholic Church, and they both chose the same papal name, Leo. So what is in a name? That's a big philosophical question that's been debated for a long time, sometimes under the contest between realism and nominalism. Now, I really hate to get into this in front of so many Dominicans, but I hope you will be kind to me and I will be in and out before you notice. Well, realism says there are universals, entities somehow distinct from the particular examples we have of a thing. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, for example. That suggests there's a property of roseness that in some sense exists apart from any particular rose. That's realism. On the other hand, you have something called nominalism, which says the only thing we really have is the individual items, and we name them for our convenience, and we group them together for our convenience, but it's nothing more than that. For any of you who have read Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, you might remember the last sentence. Stat rosa pristina nomine, nomina nuda tenemus. And we have to have some Latin here because this is the Center for Dominican and Catholic Studies, and that means that the rose, the original rose, the pristine rose, remains only by name. We hold only on to the naked name. There is no roseness. Okay, there we go. That was the hard part. But how does that affect our question? How does that affect the whole talk? On the one hand, we are talking about names. There is no essence of Leo-ness that we can expect from both popes, right? On the other hand, in the Catholic Christian tradition, names are not merely names. Whether we are talking about baptismal names, confirmational names, or even the regal names of kings and queens. These names refer to persons, now passed from this life, whom we hope are participating in the communion of saints and whom we hope will aid us in some sense. Our patron saints are active friends and guides, not merely distant inspirations. So when Robert Prevost took the name Leo XIV, he did intend to honor Leo XIII. But he didn't just take a name as a matter of remote honor. He took a name and created a relationship for ongoing help and inspiration from someone who walked a similar path before him. So it is fair for us to ponder, I think, not only the reasons that Prevost explicitly turned to Leo XIII, but also the points at which he might find some help and inspiration from the earlier Leo's life and work. It is also fair to ponder the message he is sending to the broader community of church and world by choosing that name. After all, names communicate something of the intention of the namer. No one made that point more vividly with respect to papal names than one of my favorite comedians named Kathleen Madigan. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's a Catholic from St. Louis, and she's very funny. And she was a while ago advocating, after the loss of one pope and in time for the election of another, that the new pope choose the name Pope Hilarious, who was actually the Bishop of Rome from 461 to 486. She did not, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, get her way. But imagine how different the papacy of Joseph Ratzinger would have been had he been called Pope Hilarious II rather than Benedict XV. So that's a little bit about names, which I think is important to keep in mind. What can we say about the man who became Leo XIII? Well, unlike Leo XIV, he was born into a noble family in 1810 and promoted quickly in the church. He was doubtless brilliant. He earned doctorates in theology, civil law, and canon law by the time he was 26, and immediately put on a fast track toward administrative significance. Pope Gregory XVI appointed him a papal legate to Benevento, which was the smallest papal province. And he didn't just sit there and wait to move. He faced some big trouble, the mafia. And according to what I read about him, he arrested the most powerful aristocrat in Benevento. I'm sorry, I'm mutilating the term. And his troops captured others who were either killed or imprisoned by him. He cleaned out the mob in his little town. And with public order restored, he turned to the economy and a reform of the tax system to stimulate trade with neighboring provinces. So this was not a man who was only dedicated to celestial well-being. He was dedicated to the well-being of human beings on earth as well. He was always concerned with social justice and opposed to corruption, particularly when it affected ordinary people. After he was moved to Perugia in 1841, it was claimed or brought to his attention that a bakery was selling bread below the prescribed pound rate. So he personally went there, had all the bread weighed, and confiscated it if it was below legal weight. The confiscated bread was distributed to the poor. So in his whole life and work, the work of justice and the elevating impulses of Christian love were not separate. They were truly integrated. And I think that is one piece of the puzzle that I hope Leo XIV will bring forward, the integration of love and justice, the elevation of the norms of justice by love and attention to the dignity of human beings. But we'll get there. What did the Pope do, Pope Leo XIII, that is, as Archbishop of Perugia, where he served from 1846 to 1878, 32 years. He founded homeless shelters. He opened branches of a bank that focused on low-income people and provided them with low-interest loans. He created soup kitchens, and he donated all the resources for the celebration of his elevation to cardinal to charity. As Pope, he continued these themes and expanded them. He worked to create a working relationship and mutual respect between the church and the modern world in very new times. The church had lost, right, its papal states. It was losing its temporal influence, and its authority was increasingly moral rather than political. How do you face that period? We face that kind of challenge as well, and I think we have to name that. The sex abuse crisis had us lose a certain kind of moral authority in the broader world. How do we rebuild that moral authority by also rebuilding spiritual authority? So the crisis of a loss of a base of power is one thing, not the only thing that the two Leos have in common. He endorsed learning, not only elevating the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, but also opening the Vatican archives to researchers. And most importantly, he aimed at integrating without distorting faith and reason, justice and love, and the temporal and spiritual needs of the human beings for whom he was responsible. All of these aspects of Leo XIII's lives I see resonating with the lives of his successor, Leo XIV. Before he became Pope, Leo XIV spent many years in Peru. He practiced the integration of love and justice. He waded into flooded areas wearing rubber boots to deliver relief supplies. He raised funds to install 3 oxygen plants during COVID-19, and that pandemic really affected Peru. He dealt with governments that were not always committed fully to the rule of law. And he is, like Leo XIII, deeply committed to engaging contemporary challenges in a way that is constructive, without excessive fear on the one hand, or adulation for newness. Leo XIV writes, "Today, the Church continues to offer everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and its developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor." So, and I also want to add, like Leo XIII, he has a deep connection and devotion to the Virgin Mother, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And you may say, well, why is that important? Well, Dominicans are very well known for the devotion to Mary. And I think that the devotion to Mary is actually, and I'm no Mariologist, but I was thinking this on the drive down, is actually one way in which Catholics integrate the incarnation and the concern for human beings and human life in our sad and sometimes messy and often hurting bodies, right? Because other religious traditions didn't have an incarnate God. Athena was born fully formed from the head of Zeus. You're not worried about bodily impairment then. If you have a mother, you are a human being. There's no doubt that you're embedded in the messiness of life. So that's actually just a suggestion for anybody that wants to work on Mariology, a little commercial message there. You can bring Mariology and social teaching together in fabulous ways. So I just want in my, in just a couple of moments to say that what I think of a few views from Rerum Novarum that I think Pope Leo XIV could bring to bear. One, Leo XIII had a very Catholic view of society. What do you mean by that, you might ask? Good question. Well, it's realistic, not ideological. You recognize the society as it is. You read the signs of the times. You recognize where people are hurting. That can be talked about in terms of Vatican II and Gaudium Spes, pay attention to the signs of the times, but it was present all the way along. There are hungry people who need to be fed. There are structures that are harming people. We have to see what the world is if we're going to help the people in it. Second, it's ordered toward the common good. What's the common good? Well, it requires a type of moderation and balance. And you see this in Rerum Novarum, right? On the one hand, he condemned rapacious capitalism, right? In which a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than slavery itself. But he's not going to go to the entire other extreme, right? He's going to say, yes, that's a problem. We fix that problem, but we do not get rid of private property altogether, because private property is a natural right. And one of the reasons we know it's a natural right is that it's good for poor people because it allows them to amass wealth and pass it down to the next generation. Third, dignity has a social form. Pope Leo XIII strikingly emphasized the dignity of all work, including manual labor. He emphasized, as Professor Hittinger pointed out, the importance of the family and family autonomy. He emphasized that life is often difficult and to some degree unequal. But that inequality does not affect our fundamental status as human beings in either church or state. We are all members of the body of Christ, and we are all members of the state. Listen to this quotation. There is another and deeper consideration which must not be lost sight of. As regards the state, the interests of all, whether high or low, are equal. The members of the working classes are citizens by nature and by the same right as the rich. They are real parts, living the life which makes up, through the family, the body of the Commonwealth. And it need hardly be said that they are in every city very largely in the majority. And third, dignity and protecting the material conditions of dignity is a task of the state. So the state is not supposed to take away all private property, but it is to save unfortunate working people from the cruelty of men of greed who use human beings as mere instruments for money-making. So the state has a positive role in setting out the terms of our relationships, both protecting private property, but also protecting people who are vulnerable from exploitation from those who, through God's gifts, may have more of it than others. I have more to say, but I will stop here because my 15 minutes is up and we can have a chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists. We have some time for questions. If there's anyone who would like to kick things off. Yes.
I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Kaveny, and that has to do with the name Leo. Just to take it a step further. With Leo XIII, was he in some way referencing back to a previous Leo, perhaps the Leo the Great? And what would be the implications not only for him, but for our court?
He was definitely referring back to the prior Leos, but I think Professor Hittinger is probably in a better position to answer that question because he knows more about the prior Leos than I do.
Well, Leo the Great, and right to the left of the back of St. Peter's is a huge painting of Leo the Great stopping the invasion by the Huns. And it is reported that Leo prayed the night before his election in front of that picture. And that's where he took the name from, having the courage to stand up to Attila. Yeah.
So I had the privilege of meeting Pope Leo XIV before he was Pope Leo XIV last fall in Rome, and he gave a talk about his work as a member of the dicastery for bishops. So what I was really struck by was how he viewed the importance of that role. So I'm wondering, going into his papacy, how much he's going to continue doing that sort of investigation into shaping the church through bishops.
Well, one of the things that has emerged, so this role was mentioned, and just for clarification, if that title's not familiar to you, the head of the dicastery for bishops is the one whose key role in the Vatican is to propose to the Pope men who should be named bishop. So he's really the head bishop maker, as it were. So this was his role in the Vatican. And it has emerged as one of the very obvious things that this was in fact the man that was connected to everyone. So while he might not have been one of the celebrity papabile, he might not have been one of the big famous names that was being proposed for Pope, he was in fact the one who knew all of the bishops of the world because it was his job to make them. So what we can say about him going forward from this job is the obvious consequence of that, which is that he knows all of the bishops of the world. And many of them he's helped to make in these recent years. So I think that that's key. The other thing that I would point out to you all is that he was a very active member of the Synod on Synodality, which is the great reform project of Pope Francis for the Church. And earlier this week in this interview with Elise Allen, which I referenced several times, he described synodality as being the project of dialogue, which of course is not novel. This is what Pope Francis was saying as well. But what I think is very interesting about Pope Leo XIV is that he has actually heard the concerns of all of these men because of the needs that are presented to the church in the making of bishops. So he, by nature of this job, is the one who has had to hear the needs for all the dioceses of the world as he names leaders for those various dioceses. So if ever there were a person who was practiced in this art of ecclesial dialogue, which is being called and discussed as synodality now, you would have to say that it would be the person who was the head of that dicastery, it seems to me.
Thank you all for a wonderfully stimulating presentation. I'm going to frame my question by reaffirming the significance of the name of something and how that relates to our understanding of it. So taking very diverse enterprises that all involve some kind of machine learning and condensing those under the signifier AI is actually a really important thing of the social reality that's unfolding. And so the people who are most dedicated to selling AI in a variety of contexts, but especially to universities, very much have an interest in creating a kind of enthusiasm for AI and calling this sort of the age of AI. And so I guess my question, which any of you could reflect on, is to what degree would our present Pope sort of be open to the thought that there's a kind of a hype machine working to sell AI, and we might have some questions about whether or not AI is in fact going to be as revolutionary as those who are trying to sell it to all of us would like us to believe, or to what degree does he think, no, the hype merchants are actually correct in tracking the truth of the matter, and this really is going to be the age of AI. I hope there was a coherent question there.
That is a fantastic question, and I think it's a very important one to ask. What is AI? We've got a big label, a big umbrella that includes all sorts of things from, targeted searches in Google to, mammograms that are read with computer-assisted technology to, deep fakes to ChatGPT, and calling them all by one label is I think a deeply deceptive process. It encourages either a utopian or a catastrophic response to it. So we need to pull it apart and look at each thing and say, well, what is that thing and how is that going to affect our lives together? So, I don't know anybody who would be opposed to computer-assisted mammography, for example. That's a great thing. It can help save lives. That's one thing. ChatGPT, for students writing papers, we've got a different set of problems. I don't think we should catastrophize over some of that either. I don't know if any of you are in the room who remember something called the Texas Instruments calculator. At one point in my life, I used to be able to use a log table to do derivatives and then at that point, you get a Texas Instrument calculator and you can't. So certain skills go away. People who learned Homer could memorize, huge poems. Most people can't do that anymore. So we need to see, well, what are the skills they're gaining and what are the skills they're losing, and make sure they keep the skills they need in thinking about the education. I think this Leo is going to be, very sensitive to nuance and moderation in responding to all of this. But we, especially in America, have a tendency to, to get all wrapped up in the latest thing and turn it into either a savior or a demon. And I think about, genetics, for example. If you were around in the year 2000, this was supposed to be rewriting everything, the genetic code. It was all going. We cloned Dolly. What's next? And as it turned out, we have significant ethical challenges, but we're not living in a dystopia. And I think that he will be able to draw some distinctions.
One of the disturbing things about AI, especially for us, we're involved in education, is that the older machines didn't know words. And the game has really changed. Now, I'm not sure it's disaster, but when the machine knows words, and we have to go back to 2001 Space Odyssey for that. Remember at the very end, the machine tells the astronaut not to murder it and gives a perfectly reasonable and emotionally sensitive argument why it should not be turned off. That's capturing something 60 years before. Okay. Words make a real difference. Aristotle 101. I mean, that we are like other animals in many respects, but we are dependent upon words, or the word. So we've invited a machine that can probably make students look second rate.
Make students what?
Look second rate.
Yeah.
Or at least what they're writing or saying sounds second rate. So, these are disturbing kinds of issues. But so far, if you go to even a moderate kind of AI program, and you say, what was so important about Leo XIII? I'm going to guarantee you're going to get a paragraph on Rerum Novarum. I'll bet. And it won't be bad, but it won't be good.
I think that that's true. It's probably going to get better, but the facts about Leo that I gave you today came from one biography and his Wikipedia page, right? There are ways of doing research that can use these materials that can be helpful, right? But as long as you're not using them to stop the thought that you need to have. But we need to discover then, I think we've got a bigger problem with education. If your only reason to get your degree at Providence College is so that you can major in business and go work at Morgan Stanley when you're 22 and then buy your house on Martha's Vineyard when you're 30, then your education is just an external good. What we have to convey is the goods, Alistair McIntyre would say, internal in the practice of education. How reading these texts and grappling with them changes your mind. And where do we see what these internal goods look like? And I say this as somebody who has no talent for this whatsoever, is actually in sports. You talk to coaches, you talk to the people that run the little swim team. These people are never going to be Olympic swimmers, but we convey to them what it is to swim and to do that with your body, with the water. It's a good internal to the practice. How come academics aren't as good as conveying that as coaches are?
Sorry, and I know it's late, and I apologize for one last question, but the shot at the business school, I got to ask a question. So I'm a finance professor, and you don't ordinarily think of papal encyclicals having much to do with finance, but PC is a little bit different, and students do go to Morgan Stanley, but hopefully as well-grounded ethical thinkers, grounded in the Dominican tradition. I teach investments. One of the things that we do in looking at investments is the investment policy statement. In my class, a lot of that is based on guidance on socially responsible investing from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. The latest revision that just came out had dramatically from the one from 2003 affected by Laudato Si, with strong emphasis on investing in companies that are harmful to the environment and worker rights and things like that. What's going to happen if Pope Leo is as focused on AI, and there's very brief mention in the latest USCCB guidance? In talking with Father Thomas more about this recently, we're not worried about ChatGPT as much as we're worried about companies like Palantir that are, autonomous weapon systems and things like that, but more how these companies have the potential to have an assault on our humanity. And should we be steering away from companies that make a profit at the expense of human dignity from an AI perspective?
I'll let you back clean up, so I'll make a mess and you can tidy things up. So earlier this year, there was a situation where a major Catholic media company tested out an AI chatbot that was dressed as a priest, and it was called Father Justin, and you could go to Father Justin. I wish people would go to this one, which is really the point. Luckily, it was shouted down by the Catholic internet community, and the company had to retract the product and go a different route. Hilariously, this week it was proposed to the Holy Father that they create a Pope chatbot. And when this was told to me, I roared laughing. It took me 5 minutes to recover. It's like, have you been paying attention at all to this narrative? That is not happening. But anyway, so the point that I would wish to make is that there is a sensitivity among people, and I think it's a growing sensitivity among people, for something that is real and something that is human. And I think that one thing that we're going to continue to see is that as this tear between online reality and actual reality, as the tear of this fabric grows, we have the ability to fight for things that are more humane and to win. And so the example of the Catholic media company chatbot is a silly one, but I think it shows the power of a human community forcing a decision that is for the good of that community. And again, it was because people wanted real Father Justin, not fake computer Father Justin.
I haven't taught undergraduates in 6 years, but graduate students are difficult enough without having to do both. And I have changed my exams. And I say, you can bring for the final exam, I teach a course in the City of God. Bring your book, bring all of your notes, or even bring other books. You come into class and I say, turn your computers on. And then I say, disconnect from the internet. You got 3 hours, go for it. And my logic on this is, even if AI could write a better 3-hour exam on the City of God than the student, it's pretty important to see how the students can do. In other words, take a crack at it. Why not? And I just solved that. AI could probably write a better 10-page paper. Oh, we're close to it. Very close to it. But I want to see the student do it. Right? And I'm not going to grade the student against the machine.
Thank you. I just want to apologize I did not mean to insult the entire business section. And I think that it was just a little bit of a flippant remark, but there are some students who do go, and it's so good that PC is providing a broader context. I would also say that this is another area where I think, my guild, and by guild here, I'm talking about not the law guild, but the moral theology guild, needs to do a bit more work. We've gotten into biomedical ethics, we've gotten into, other sorts of, special ethics, but I don't think we know as much about how the financial world operates. So that as we need to be able to engage in a vigorous dialogue about how moral theology can affect decisions about investment. And most of us, unfortunately, are the sort of people who go to our ATMs and say, "How much money do I have?" "Oh, okay, that's enough." So we're not generally in that framework, but we need to push ourselves.
Do you use Robinhood?
Robinhood? No. What is Robinhood? Oh God.
Well, it's pretty handy.
I'll have to get some advice.
Thank you all again for coming, and thanks to our panelists. Before we all depart, I just make a shout out. Our next big public event will be a book launch for Dr. Vance Morgan, his book, A Year of Faith and Philosophy. So look out, I'm going to blitz your emails with the ads.